An orphaned teenager helped an elderly woman carry groceries, never knowing she was his grandmother. The thought never crossed Lucas Bennett's mind as he spotted the frail woman struggling with her bags in the pouring rain, her thin arms trembling beneath the weight. It was just another gray Tuesday in Millfield, the kind of day where the sky seems permanently etched in charcoal, where the rain doesn't so much fall as it seeps into everything: clothes, sidewalks, souls. Lucas pulled his worn hoodie tighter around his lanky frame. 17 years old with no family to speak of, no real home beyond the rotating mercy of the foster system. His current placement was ending in 2 weeks. Something about the funding or paperwork or whatever excuse adults used when they were done with you. He'd stopped listening to the details years ago. The bus shelter offered minimal protection, but Lucas huddled there anyway, watching the rain transform the world into something blurry and indistinct, like his future, like his past. School had been particularly brutal today. Another fight, another threat of suspension. Not his fault, not really, but it never mattered whose fault it was. It only mattered who had parents to call, who had someone to speak up for them. That's when he saw her, white-haired, hunched against the weather, trying to manage 4 grocery bags while simultaneously wrangling an umbrella that the wind seemed determined to claim. Something about her reminded him of something, someone, a memory he couldn't quite grasp, like trying to hold mist. Lucas didn't make a conscious decision. His body simply moved, propelled by some instinct deeper than thought. The rain immediately soaked through his hoodie, plastering his dark hair to his forehead, running cold fingers down his spine. "Ma'am," his voice came out rougher than intended. Too many days of saying too little. "Can I help you with those?" The woman turned, startled. Her eyes, a clear, vibrant blue even in the gray downpour, widened slightly. For a moment, something flickered across her face. Recognition? Fear? Lucas couldn't tell. He was used to both reactions from strangers. A tall, scowling teenager with a fading bruise beneath one eye rarely inspired trust. "Oh," she said, her voice soft but steady. "That's very kind of you, young man." Lucas reached for the heaviest bags, careful not to brush against her fingers. People didn't like to be touched by boys from the system. He'd learned that lesson early. "I live just up the hill," she said, nodding toward Cherry Street, where modest but well-kept homes climbed the gentle slope. "Are you sure you don't mind? You're getting soaked." Lucas shrugged. "I'm already wet." The truth was, he had nowhere particular to be. The Mortons, his current foster family, wouldn't notice if he came home now or 3 hours from now. They had their own kids, their own lives. Lucas was just passing through like always. They walked in silence for a moment, the woman struggling to keep pace with Lucas's long strides until he consciously slowed down. The rain drummed against the umbrella she now held more securely, creating a small mobile shelter that didn't quite cover them both. "I'm Margaret," she offered eventually. "Margaret Wilson." Lucas nodded, not volunteering his name in return. Names led to questions. Questions led to pity, and pity was the one thing he couldn't stomach. "Not anymore. You don't talk much, do you?" There was no judgment in her voice, just a gentle observation. Not much to say. The words came out harsher than he'd intended, and he immediately regretted it. This woman, Margaret, had done nothing to deserve his bitterness. But she only smiled, a small, soft thing that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Sometimes the quietest people have the most worthwhile things to say when they choose to speak. Something about those words, their kindness, their absence of demand, loosened a knot in Lucas's chest he hadn't realized was there. They reached her house, a modest blue 2-story with white trim and a small porch adorned with wind chimes that danced and sang in the gusting breeze. Margaret fumbled with her keys, her fingers stiff with arthritis or cold or both. "Would you mind?" She held the keys out to Lucas, another small act of trust that felt inexplicably significant. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and old books. It was warm, not just in temperature, but in essence. Walls painted in soft yellows, furniture well-worn but well-loved. Photographs in simple frames capturing moments of a life Lucas would never know. "Just set those on the counter if you would," Margaret directed, gesturing toward a kitchen that looked straight out of another era. "Would you like some hot chocolate? You must be freezing." Lucas should have said no, should have dropped the groceries and left, should have retreated back into the rain and anonymity. Instead, he heard himself say, "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." Margaret smiled again, this time broader, revealing a slight gap between her front teeth. "Excellent. Take off that wet hoodie. There's a radiator in the hallway where you can hang it." As Lucas obeyed, he caught sight of a photograph on the wall. A young woman with sandy blonde hair and the same blue eyes as Margaret, holding a baby wrapped in a blue blanket. Something about the image tugged at him, a splinter of memory too small to grasp. "My daughter," Margaret said, noticing his gaze. "And my grandson." Her voice held a weight that Lucas recognized, the gravity of loss. That was taken almost 17 years ago now. Lucas turned, calculating quickly. "Your grandson would be about my age." Margaret nodded, her hands busy preparing the hot chocolate. "Yes, he would." She didn't elaborate, and Lucas didn't ask. Everyone had their stories, their wounds. You didn't prod at strangers' scars. The hot chocolate came in a chipped mug adorned with faded cardinals. Real chocolate, not the powdered stuff, topped with a small cloud of whipped cream that began melting immediately, creating swirls of white in the dark richness below. "Thank you," Lucas said, meaning it for more than just the drink. The warmth of the mug seeped into his perpetually cold hands. "You're very welcome." Margaret sat across from him at the small kitchen table, her own mug clasped between hands marked with age spots and a lifetime of work. "Do you live around here? I don't think I've seen you before." The question was innocuous, but Lucas tensed anyway. "Sort of, for now." He took a sip of hot chocolate to avoid elaborating, the sweetness flooding his mouth with an unexpected comfort. Margaret seemed to sense his discomfort. "I've lived here for 42 years. Watched the neighborhood change. Trees grow, children become parents themselves." Her gaze drifted to the window, where rain still painted jagged streaks down the glass. "It's a strange thing, time. It moves so slowly when you're young, each day an eternity. Then suddenly you're old and decades feel like minutes." Lucas didn't know how to respond to that kind of reflection. His life had been measured in placements, not years. 14 different homes since he was 6. No place long enough to watch a tree grow or see seasons change on the same street. "I should go," he said abruptly, setting down the half-finished hot chocolate. "Thanks for the drink." Margaret didn't try to stop him, didn't press him to stay, which somehow made Lucas wish she would. "Your hoodie's probably still wet," she said instead. "Wait here a moment." She disappeared into another room, returning with a navy blue sweater that looked worn but clean. "This was my son-in-law's. He was tall like you. It's just gathering dust here." Lucas shook his head. "I can't take that. You'd be doing me a favor," Margaret insisted. "It's one less thing cluttering my closet." She held it out, a silent invitation free of charity sting. After a moment's hesitation, Lucas accepted the sweater. It was soft against his skin, heavy in a way that felt like protection. "Thank you. Will you be walking this way again?" Margaret asked as she walked him to the door. "I don't drive anymore. Arthritis makes it difficult. I usually manage my groceries, but on rainy days." She trailed off, leaving the question unasked but present. Lucas should have lied. Should have said no. Should have ensured this random intersection of lives remained singular, contained. Instead, he found himself nodding. "I take this route home from school. Tuesdays and Thursdays." Margaret's smile was like sunlight breaking through the clouds. "Well, if you ever want more hot chocolate, my door's open." No pressure, of course. Lucas stepped back into the rain, which had gentled to a soft mist. The sweater was warm, the lingering taste of chocolate sweet on his tongue. For the first time in as long as he could remember, the constant weight in his chest had lightened, just a fraction. He looked back once to see Margaret still in the doorway, a small figure framed by golden light watching him go. Lucas told himself he wouldn't return. What was the point? In 2 weeks, he'd be placed somewhere new, probably across town or even in another district. Attachments were pointless, dangerous even. But 2 days later, he found himself walking past the blue house with white trim. Just walking past, he insisted to himself. Nothing more. Margaret was in the front yard, struggling with a rake too large for her small frame, attempting to gather leaves made heavy by rain. Lucas stopped, watched, battled with himself. Then he crossed the street. "Need some help?" His voice was still rough, still unpracticed. But Margaret turned with that same bright smile, as if his appearance was expected. "Welcomed even." "Lucas, I was hoping I'd see you again." She remembered his name. He'd only mentioned it once, mumbled over hot chocolate, yet she caught it, held it, returned it to him now like a gift. "I can do that," he said, nodding toward the rake. "Oh, would you?" "My shoulders aren't what they used to be." She surrendered the rake without hesitation, another small act of trust. "There's apple cider inside when you're done. Homemade." Lucas worked methodically, clearing the small yard with an efficiency born from years of trying to make himself useful in other people's homes. Margaret watched from the porch steps, occasionally commenting on the weather or asking undemanding questions that Lucas could answer with a nod or a single word. The strange thing was, he found himself offering more. Short sentences at first, then longer ones. By the time he finished with the leaves, he told her about his interest in drawing, something he'd never mentioned to the Mortons or his teachers or anyone at all. "I'd love to see your work sometime," Margaret said as they sat on the porch, drinking cider that tasted of autumn and comfort. "If you'd want to show me, that is." Lucas studied his worn sneakers. "They're not very good." "Well, I'm not a very good judge," Margaret countered with a small laugh. "My artistic ability stops at stick figures. But I know what I like." The next Tuesday, Lucas brought his sketchbook, a tattered spiral-bound thing filled with charcoal drawings. City scenes mostly, buildings and empty parks, the occasional stray dog or pigeon. One portrait of a woman whose features were blurred, as if seen through rain or tears or the fog of infant memory. Margaret looked through each drawing carefully, taking her time, occasionally asking about a particular detail or perspective. Not once did she offer that generic praise adults usually gave kids. "These are great," or "You're so talented," which always rang false. Instead, she asked questions. Engaged. "So, this one," she said, pausing at the blurred portrait. "Who is this?" Lucas shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable. "No one. Just practicing faces." Margaret studied it a moment longer, something shifting in her expression before she turned the page. "You have a gift for capturing feeling, Lucas. Not just what things look like, but what they feel like." Over the next 2 weeks, Lucas found himself at Margaret's house more often than not. Always with some excuse, helping with yard work, fixing a leaky faucet, reaching items on high shelves. But the truth was simpler and more frightening. He liked being there, liked the quiet companionship, the absence of expectations, the way Margaret treated him like a person rather than a case number or a problem. She never asked about his parents or why he moved around so much, though Lucas suspected she'd figured it out. Instead, she shared stories from her own life. Growing up during harder times, her work as a nurse, the daughter who had left Millfield young and in love. "She was headstrong, my Caroline," Margaret said one afternoon as they sat shelling peas at the kitchen table. "Brilliant and beautiful and absolutely certain she knew best." His smile touched her lips, but her eyes held shadows. "She married young, just 19. He was a good man, though." Kind. They were so happy. Lucas kept his eyes on the peas, his fingers working mechanically. "What happened to them?" he finally asked, breaking his rule about not probing others' wounds. Margaret was quiet for so long that Lucas thought she hadn't heard him, or was choosing not to answer. Finally, she said, "There was an accident. A rainy night, a truck driver who fell asleep at the wheel. Her hands stilled. Caroline died instantly. David, her husband, lingered for a few days." "I'm sorry," Lucas said, the words inadequate but sincere. Margaret nodded, acknowledging both his sympathy and its limitations. "They had a baby, just 6 months old." Her voice caught. "I was going to raise him, of course. He was all I had left of Caroline. But there were complications, legal issues with David's family. They lived overseas, had resources I didn't." She looked out the window to where the maple tree in her yard was beginning to turn gold at its edges. "I lost him too." Lucas felt a strange hollowness open up in his chest. "That's not right," he said, his voice low and fierce. "They shouldn't have been able to take him from you." Margaret's smile was sad but gentle. "Life isn't always fair, is it? But we go on. We find new ways to love, new people to care for." She reached across the table and, for the first time, placed her hand over Lucas's. "Like you, coming into my life just when I was starting to think I'd be alone forever." The touch was brief, light as a butterfly landing, but it left an imprint Lucas could feel long after she withdrew. That night, in the small bedroom at the Mortons' house that had never felt like his, Lucas lay awake staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow the social worker would come. Tomorrow he'd be moved again, to a new family, a new temporary life. He hadn't told Margaret, hadn't found the words or the courage. It was easier to just disappear, the way he always did, the way people had always disappeared from his life. But as he finally drifted towards sleep, Lucas realized this time was different. This time, the thought of vanishing without a word felt like a betrayal. This time, he would have to say goodbye. The next morning, Lucas went to school with his few possessions packed in his backpack. Some clothes, his sketchbook, and the navy blue sweater Margaret had given him. The social worker would pick him up directly from school at 3:15. By dinner, he'd be starting over again with strangers. He couldn't focus on classes. His mind kept returning to the blue house, to Margaret's hands working deftly despite their arthritis, to the way she listened as if his words mattered. At lunch break, Lucas made a decision. He walked out of the school gates and headed toward Cherry Street. He only had an hour, but it would be enough to say goodbye properly. When he reached Margaret's house, he hesitated on the sidewalk. Through the front window, he could see her sitting in her armchair, reading glasses perched on her nose, intent on whatever book rested in her lap. The familiarity of the image made his chest ache. Lucas knocked softly, then more firmly when there was no response. Margaret opened the door, surprise giving way to pleasure on her face. "Lucas, shouldn't you be in school?" Then noting his expression, her smile faded. "What's wrong?" "I'm leaving," he said bluntly. "Today, new placement." Margaret's hand fluttered to her throat, as if to catch words or feelings that might escape. "I see," she said finally. "Would you like to come in for a moment?" Lucas shook his head. "Can't. Have to get back for last period. The social worker's picking me up after." Where will you be going?" "Oak Ridge. Other side of the county." Lucas stared at a point just past Margaret's shoulder, unable to meet her eyes. "Just wanted to say thanks for everything." Margaret stepped onto the porch, closing the distance between them. "Lucas, look at me." Reluctantly, he did. Her blue eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "You have brought more joy into my life in these few weeks than I've known in years. I want you to remember that, and I want you to know that this isn't goodbye. Not if you don't want it to be." Lucas frowned. "I won't be able to visit. It's too far. There are phones, letters." Margaret reached out, her hand hovering near his arm but not quite touching, respecting the boundary he'd always maintained. "If you want to stay in contact, we will find a way." The lump in Lucas's throat made speech impossible. He nodded instead. "Wait here," Margaret said suddenly, disappearing back into the house. She returned moments later with a small wooden box. "I want you to have this." Lucas accepted it hesitantly. The box was old, the wood smooth from years of handling. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, was a silver pocket watch. "It was my husband's," Margaret explained, "and his father's before him." "I can't take this," Lucas protested, trying to return it. "It's too valuable." Margaret closed his fingers around the box. "Some things are meant to be passed down, Lucas. I have no one else to give it to." The school bell would be ringing soon. Lucas knew he should go, but his feet seemed rooted to the porch. "I'll call," he promised, "as soon as I'm settled." Margaret smiled, though tears now slipped freely down her cheeks. "I'll be waiting." Then, as if unable to help herself, she reached up and touched his face. Just once, her fingers cool against his skin. "Be well, Lucas. Be happy." Lucas turned quickly, hiding his own tears, and hurried down the steps. At the sidewalk, he looked back. "Goodbye, Margaret." "Not goodbye," she corrected gently. "Until next time." Oak Ridge was exactly as Lucas had expected. Another town, another house, another family trying their best but already stretched thin. The Connors had 2 biological children and another foster child, a quiet 12-year-old girl named Zoe who rarely spoke. Lucas went through the motions, new school, new routine, new rules to learn. But every evening, he took out the silver pocket watch, running his thumb over the intricate engravings on its case. And once a week, he called Margaret, their conversations becoming the only constant in his shifting life. 2 months into his stay with the Connors, Lucas came home from school to find Mrs. Connor waiting for him with an odd expression. "There's someone here to see you," she said, gesturing toward the living room. Lucas's first thought was that it must be his social worker with news of another move. Instead, he found Margaret sitting primly on the edge of the sofa, looking smaller somehow outside the context of her blue house, but just as dignified. "Margaret?" He stopped in the doorway, certain he was imagining her presence. She stood smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. "Hello, Lucas." "What are you doing here?" The question came out harsher than he'd intended, colored by confusion. "I need to speak with you." Her eyes flicked toward Mrs. Connor, who hovered in the background, privately if possible. Mrs. Connor nodded. "You can use the back porch. It's enclosed." The porch was cold, winter finding its way through the thin windows, but neither of them suggested moving elsewhere. Margaret sat in one of the wicker chairs, her back straight, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Lucas?" she began, then seemed to falter. For the first time since he'd known her, Margaret appeared uncertain, almost afraid. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you weeks ago." A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature crept up Lucas's spine. "What is it?" Margaret took a deep breath. The day you helped me with my groceries wasn't the first time I'd seen you. I recognized you immediately." Her voice trembled slightly. "I've been looking for you for almost 11 years. Lucas stared at her, uncomprehending. "What are you talking about?" "The grandson I told you about. The one in the photograph. The baby I lost to legal complications." Margaret's eyes, so blue and so familiar, filled with tears. "It was you, Lucas. You're Caroline's son. You're my grandson." The world seemed to tilt beneath Lucas's feet. "That's not..." he started, then stopped. The photograph on Margaret's wall. The woman with sandy blonde hair and blue eyes. The baby in the blue blanket. "My mother's name was Caroline?" Margaret nodded, tears now flowing freely. "Caroline Ann Wilson. She married David Bennett when she was 19. You were born on March 12th. His birthday. His last name. Details that matched. But still, if you're my grandmother, why didn't you raise me? Why was I in the system?" The questions came out raw, accusatory. David's parents lived in England. They had money, influence. After the accident, they filed for custody, claiming I was too old, too poor to raise a child properly. Margaret's hands twisted together. They won temporary custody while the case proceeded. But then, they changed their minds, decided they didn't want the responsibility after all. So they just... What? Gave me up? The hollowness in Lucas's chest expanded, threatening to consume him. By then, I was deemed unfit due to health issues. I'd had a minor heart attack from the stress. You were placed in foster care, and I was only granted very limited visitation. Margaret's voice broke. Then you were adopted when you were 6, and I lost all contact. The family moved away, changed your name. It took years of legal battles just to get information about where you were. Lucas stood abruptly, pacing the small porch. "If this is true, if you're really my grandmother, prove it." Without hesitation, Margaret reached into her purse and withdrew a worn envelope. From it, she pulled several photographs. Lucas as a baby in Margaret's arms. Lucas as a toddler on a tricycle. Lucas at about 5 sitting on the very porch steps where they'd said their goodbyes. "I have your birth certificate." Margaret continued, her voice steadier now. "Your medical records from when you were an infant. The court documents from the custody battle." She looked up at him, her face open and vulnerable. "But more than that, I have the watch." "The watch?" "The pocket watch I gave you. Look at the inscription inside the case." With shaking hands, Lucas withdrew the silver watch from his pocket. He'd examined it many times but had never thought to open the case. Inside, engraved in flowing script, were the words, "To Lucas David Bennett with eternal love. Your family is forever, M.W." "I had that engraved the day you were born," Margaret said softly. "It was meant to be a gift for your 18th birthday." Lucas sank back into the chair, the watch heavy in his palm. 1,000 thoughts collided in his mind. Questions, accusations, grief for what might have been. But cutting through it all was a strange, growing certainty. A recognition that went beyond logic or evidence. "I drew you," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "That portrait in my sketchbook, the blurry one. I've been drawing the same face since I was little. I always thought it was a dream or something I saw in a movie. You remember me?" Margaret's voice held a fragile hope, not consciously, but somewhere. Lucas touched his chest. "In here, maybe." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of revelation settling around them like snow. "What now?" Lucas finally asked. "Why come tell me this now?" Margaret straightened, some new resolve entering her posture. "Because I've filed for custody, or rather guardianship. You're 17, almost an adult, but I want to give you a home for as long as you need one. If you want it. You want me to live with you?" The concept seemed impossible, too much like the fantasies he'd stopped allowing himself years ago. More than anything in this world. Margaret leaned forward, still careful not to crowd him, not to push. "But only if that's what you want too. You're old enough now that the courts will consider your preference heavily. If you'd rather stay in the system until you age out, I'll understand. I'll still be here, still be in your life, however you'll allow me to be." Lucas looked down at the watch in his hand, at the inscription that had been waiting for him all these years. Then at the photographs, evidence of a life he couldn't remember, but that had existed nonetheless. A life with someone who had wanted him, fought for him, never stopped looking for him. "The blue sweater," he said suddenly. "It wasn't your son-in-law's, was it?" A small, sad smile touched Margaret's lips. "It was yours. Freya from before. I kept everything, Lucas. Every toy, every piece of clothing you hadn't outgrown. I kept your room exactly as it was, waiting for you to come home. Home." The word resonated in Lucas's chest, unfamiliar yet right. "Can I think about it?" he asked, not because he was uncertain, but because the magnitude of the moment demanded space, demanded breath. "Of course." Margaret rose, gathering her purse. "Take all the time you need. I've waited 11 years. I can wait a little longer." As she moved toward the door, Lucas stood too. "Margaret," she turned, "when I helped you with your groceries that day, did you know immediately who I was?" Margaret's eyes softened. "The moment I saw your face, you have your mother's eyes, your father's jaw." She hesitated. "I wanted to tell you right then, but I was afraid you'd run, afraid you wouldn't believe me. So I thought if I could just get to know you first, let you get to know me." Lucas nodded, understanding. "That's why you asked about my route home from school. I hoped you might pass by again. I prayed you would." Margaret's smile was tremulous but genuine. "And you did." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of meetings with social workers, lawyers, judges. Margaret provided documentation, testimonies from former neighbors who had known Lucas as a baby, medical records proving their genetic connection. Lucas himself spoke directly to the judge, a stern-faced woman who listened intently as he explained that yes, he wanted to live with his grandmother. Yes, he understood the situation. No, he was not being coerced. Throughout it all, the silver pocket watch remained in Lucas's pocket, a tangible connection to a past he was only beginning to reclaim. The day he moved into Margaret's house, his house, he corrected himself mentally, was bright and cold, winter sunshine glinting off fresh snow. He had few possessions to bring, but Margaret didn't comment on this. Instead, she led him upstairs to a room he'd never seen during his previous visits. "I kept it closed," she explained, her hand resting on the doorknob. "It was too painful to look at, but I couldn't bear to change it either." When she opened the door, Lucas found himself stepping into a time capsule. The room of a 6-year-old boy, bed with a rocket ship comforter, shelves lined with picture books and toy cars, walls painted a soft blue like a summer sky. On the dresser stood framed photographs. Lucas as a baby with his parents, Lucas with Margaret at what appeared to be a zoo, Lucas blowing out candles on a birthday cake. "I know it's not appropriate for a 17-year-old, Margaret said quickly. "We can change everything. Paint the walls, get new furniture, make it yours again." Lucas moved slowly around the room, touching objects from a life he couldn't remember living. A stuffed bear worn thin with love, a child's drawing framed on the wall, stick figures labeled me and Grandma, holding hands beneath a yellow sun. "I made this?" he asked, touching the frame. Margaret nodded. "You were 4. So proud of yourself for getting the fingers right. 5 on each hand," you kept pointing out. Lucas continued his exploration, opening drawers to find small clothes neatly folded, a box of crayons with the paper still intact, a collection of smooth stones obviously gathered by a child's discerning eye. "You kept everything," he murmured. "I kept everything," Margaret confirmed. "Even when they told me it was unhealthy, that I needed to move on." Her voice caught. "I couldn't let go of the hope that someday, somehow, you'd come back." Lucas turned to her then, really looked at her, this small, determined woman who had carried her grief and her hope with equal strength for 11 years, who had recognized him immediately but given him time to know her first, who had waited until he was ready. "That day," he said slowly, "when I helped you with your groceries, that wasn't an accident, was it? You struggling in the rain right when I happened to be there?" A slight flush colored Margaret's cheeks. "I may have been aware of which school you attended, and that you sometimes took that route home." The flush deepened. "And I may have deliberately chosen to shop on a day when the forecast called for rain, knowing it might prompt a kind-hearted person to offer assistance." For a moment, Lucas just stared at her. Then, to his own surprise, he began to laugh. Softly at first, then with increasing freedom. "You set the whole thing up?" Margaret's embarrassment gave way to a tentative smile. "I'd been trying to figure out how to approach you for weeks. Every scenario seemed likely to frighten you away. Then I thought, if you helped me first, if you were the one to initiate contact." She shrugged, a surprisingly youthful gesture. "I'm not proud of the manipulation, but I was desperate." Lucas shook his head, still smiling. "Devious, Grandma?" "Very devious." The word grandma hung in the air between them, new and yet ancient, strange and yet deeply right. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, Lucas," she whispered. And for the first time, it was Lucas who bridged the physical gap between them. Lucas who initiated the contact. Lucas who stepped forward and, somewhat awkwardly but with absolute certainty, wrapped his arms around the woman who had never stopped being his family, even when neither of them knew it. Margaret's arms came around him immediately, her embrace fierce despite her small stature. "My boy," she murmured against his shoulder. "My beautiful boy." Lucas closed his eyes, allowing himself to feel the wholeness of the moment. The sensation wasn't entirely new, he realized. He'd felt echoes of it every time he'd sat in Margaret's kitchen drinking hot chocolate. Every time she looked at his sketches with genuine interest. Every time she trusted him enough to share her stories and her grief. He'd been finding his way home all along, one grocery bag at a time. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, covering the world in clean possibility. Inside, in a room frozen in time but now thawing back to life, Lucas Bennett held his grandmother and allowed himself finally to believe in permanence. The silver pocket watch ticked in his pocket, marking not just seconds but a new beginning. The first moments of the rest of their life together, the life that had been waiting for them both all along. An orphaned teenager had helped an elderly woman carry groceries, never knowing she was his grandmother. But now he knew. Now they both knew. And that knowledge was the first step on a new journey, one they would take together, one grocery bag, one hot chocolate, one shared memory at a time.